Barbarian Press was established in 1977 in Kent, England, where the Elsteds worked with Graham Williams at the Florin Press, having acquired 3 flatbed hand presses. Together with many cases of type, they returned to their native Canada in 1978 and set up shop in Mission, British Columbia, about 50 miles east of Vancouver in the Fraser Valley, where they remain. To the English hand presses, they have added Vandercook Universal and Universal 3 proofing presses, 2 Chandler and Price vertical platen presses, much more type, and a small hand bindery. The press's publications range from new translations of poetry and prose, Victorian, melodrama, and new poetry to bibliography, illustrated classics, typography, and books on wood engraving. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start with something that puzzled me. Apparently, a young man full of despair once approached you and wondered aloud why you bothered to continue making books, particularly when no one cares about anything anymore. And your response to this despairing youth about why you continue the difficult and non-lucrative work was quite Beckettian. Beckettian?
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 Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Becketian?
Quote, history, even one's personal history, shows that everything is redeemable, and to give up is to confess one's choice to ignore that clearest of all human facts. Despair, in any case, is a luxury of the young, and we are now of a certain age, so we go on.
Did I say that?
Very good, darling. Well,
Yes.
that's
I have no
really.
recollection of that, but I agree
Who was
with
the
it.
youth?
I don't have no recollection of that either. I suspect that Nigel's making it up. But
The key phrase there is shows that everything is redeemable. Does that capture anything of your approach to life?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think you live long enough. You have to spend a lot of time examining yourself and what you've done in your relationship, in your work, in your relationships with other people. And if you take the attitude that you ever arrived somewhere in anything, I mean, in our marriage, in our working relationship, it's been an ongoing process, and we've both made mistakes, and we've had to go through this whole process of.
well, you haven't made very many.
Well, thank you. of adapting to one another and reconciling things and redeeming what matters.
And what does matter?
Well, can I just jump in? Because I think it goes right back to the beginning of the press, where both of us, in our various ways, realized quite early on that the big jump for us was not leaving academics, and because we were studying for doctorates when we learned to print and decided to do that instead. The big jump was not going from academics to going to printing books in a cottage industry or private press. The big difference was discovering that we didn't live entirely in our heads, but that our hands were capable of doing things. Neither of us had really ever used our hands in any craftsmanlike way. I played instruments, which is rather different because it's an interpretive process. I also acted and so on. And Jan obviously had done things. She'd done sports and she'd done various things with her hands too, in the sense of getting on with life and doing pragmatic things. But neither of us had ever thought that we would become adept with tools of any kind. At least I certainly didn't, and I don't think you'd ever thought about it.
No.
My father was one of these people who was all thumbs, and as a consequence, I grew up watching him go through various Chaplin-esque scenarios, trying to make things that never worked, and usually giving up before he even started. So I was never around tools, never around craft work at all when I was growing up. And I was very surprised, and Jan was too, I think, to discover that I actually had the capacity to do something with my hands, something artisanal, whatever the hell that is. I don't know.
Yeah. We're having problems with
the accent on the wrong
Ian's
syllable.
Yeah.
Anyway, artisanal, I think, is the way it would. Anyway, to do something as an artisan with materials which had been up to that time completely unfamiliar to me. And I suppose the thing which drew us into it initially was the end product. We loved books, and we saw books that we thought were stunningly beautiful and had never seen books like them before.
Which books?
Well, I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking the Morris books, of course, the Kelmscott books. Not that we necessarily ever aspired. Well, of course, at the beginning we were going to be the next Kelmscott Press. I think every private press is when they start, or some such. I think the book that we bought first that really persuaded us that this is what we should look at was a book by Graham Clark, the English artist, called The Vision of Wat Tyler, which he published at the Ebenezer Press. It's up there, that thing wrapped in sackcloth.
But at the point that we got it, we had no sense that we were going to be making such books.
We didn't have any sense of it.
It was a revelation to realize that other people were making such books.
That is often behind creative works or efforts. I can do this. In fact, I think I can do it better.
Well, I certainly wouldn't have said that at that time.
No, I don't think we. We just thought we'd like to do this, and what we recognized was that there could be a relationship between the form in which something was presented and the actual words themselves and the illustrations and so on, and that could enhance the experience of reading and understanding and aesthetic appreciation and so on. We never really encountered that in books before.
Well, the interesting thing too is you come from a literary background rather than a craftsman's background. So the pleasure of giving the world your interpretation of the text, I imagine that's something to do with it.
That's part of it, and the fact that we're publishing texts except in books which are purely about wood engraving, we're trying to publish texts which have some weight and some consequence, and increasingly trying to reintroduce the canon into our publishing. We still believe in the canon, not necessarily entirely as Harold Bloom sets it out, but not far off. Well, as you suggest, so many people who do the kind of work we do come into it from a graphic arts perspective. They've started as illustrators or designers or graphic designers or some such thing, and the text and the type end of it quite often comes in at the end as a means of balancing out the other work they do. This is not, of course, to say that people like that haven't produced brilliant books, because most of the books that are printed are in our little community of international private press printers are like that, are from that perspective. But we differ markedly from most of them in that particular regard, that we've come in, as you say, from the other end.
Well, I was fascinated to learn that you had actually re-edited Pericles based on research that you'd done and your insights into how the play should be presented.
I mean, that to a large extent came from another part of our background, which in this case my background, which was theatre, because I had worked as a professional actor and I have actually acted in all of Shakespeare's plays, either on the radio or on stage, and had been in Pericles twice, directed it, written music for it, and loved the play for years. Could never understand why it was neglected. Partly, of course, because it wasn't very often done. We wanted to do it to get it out there as a kind of proselytizing move. That's
another motivation.
Yes, to glorify the text and to persuade people to read things that they might not otherwise read. And this comes down to some quite small, relatively small projects like the Eve of St. Agnes. Virtually everybody would say, oh, yes, I read that in high school, but how many people have read it since? And we've discovered often that when we've published something like that, people, our subscribers and other people who buy it, actually say, I haven't read that poem since I was in high school. It's really good, isn't it? To me, that's the delight, really, of doing this kind of thing.
You ask what matters, and I don't think either one of us really answered that question. It's a difficult question to answer, right? You know that it is. I guess I sort of approach it by saying I think what matters is that every individual finds in his or her life something that is essentially fulfilling. That first of all, you discover who you are and what it is that you can do, which will make you feel most human and most part of that continuity of human experience, which is so rich in good things and bad things, but it's all there, and we can go through life going through the motions, and at the end of it look back and say, what have we done? Or if we're fortunate, we can find something where we can look back and say, we can see what we've done. We've got this book and this book and this book and this book, and we have these students who have come along and continued what we believe in, and other people who buy it and realize that there are people who care enough to put this amount of work into it and give us something which is going to enhance our experience of the world. And so we're so fortunate that not only do we find that individually, we've been able to do it together, and that's the most remarkable part, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's implicit in what you're saying is that most people see their work and their life as two separate things. You know, they live for the weekend, they live for coming home from work. Work is something that's a necessary evil. To retire at 30, as I did, and 6 or 7 or something, as you were, when we started the press. In fact, we retired. I mean, this is a joke we make. We retired at 30, and we've been doing whatever we wanted ever since, just as you've been doing with your life.
You're doing what you would do anyway.
Right. That's right. It doesn't feel like it's not labor.
Yes.
It's not labor.
Yes.
It is work. Work is good.
Well, yes. Work and sex.
Yeah.
It's Freud, I think.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. You mean sex is hard work? I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, not if you love it.
No, but what I'm saying is that what Jan was saying too is that our lives are organic in the sense that the work and the life are all bound up in one another. So it's what we do is where we're sitting right now.
Yes.
In the library, we're surrounded by books, some of which we've printed. Many others have printed by friends of ours. You know, our circle of friends is principally printers and designers and illustrators.
I guess the next question then is, can you explain why you're doing this? Is it a gift that you found what you love and it gave you fulfillment?
Well, that's certainly a gift. Yeah.
It's the fact that you found each other too. I mean, that's...
Well, we found each other first.
Yeah, before. Yeah, this was 5 years before we...
Yeah, we were... And we already shared an academic life and a love of literature and an interest particularly in Shakespeare and poetry. And then we were going to be academics because that seemed to be a way that we could sort of pursue that and make a living.
And we both like teaching.
Then the Graham Clark book came along and we went to visit him and saw what he was doing, and things just turned around. I mean, Crispin wrote a poem for friends of ours, Harry and Frances Adaskin, who were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. And he wrote a series of 5 poems called The 5 Decades. And we had already met Graham Clark, and he had introduced us to the Hale Mill where they made paper, and he was a director there. And so we were kind of introduced into the world, and we thought, wouldn't it be great to print it, or have it printed, rather than just typing it up and giving it to them. So he introduced us to Graham Williams at the Florin Press, and in 10 days we made our first book on handmade paper with Graham taking the lead, of course. I just like to say that for me, I was kind of somewhat in Crispin's wake with it until I was sitting in his little parlor. I was in the kitchen actually, and they were in the parlor where the press was. And I was working with handmade paper and tearing it, and I discovered my hands. I discovered that my hands were capable in a way that I hadn't realized before, and that I could translate from all the things that were up here through my hands into something visual and give it to other people. That was the gift, that moment of discovery. And then from there, it was just learning how to do it.
And the other gift, which I think has informed the way we do things, too, is that we were introduced, and it's really just only occurred to me this way as you were talking, that we were introduced to this craft at the kind of basic Kelmscott, if you like, level. We printed using handset type on handmade paper in the same county, at least, as Morris got his paper from, and on a hand press. Walter Tracy's Foolscap Folio Albion Press was the one we used to print that first piece.
And taught by a master printer.
And taught by a master printer who worked the same way. It wasn't as if we were introduced, as so many people are, and not that there's anything wrong with this, but at the end of starting with a Heidelberg or starting with a Vanderkruger, we started with a hand press, which is not a machine, it's a tool.
And you've stayed there.
And well, we still use them. Yes, we use other things now too, but they're to me, I think to both of us, they're the center. And hand setting type is the center of what we do.
You mentioned, having an experience in your mind. And so by completing it or presenting it to the world, it rounds out that experience, would you say?
It realizes it.
It realizes it. Yeah. It's like saying, this is how I read this text.
Well, it just occurs to me, I was talking to, in my interview with the parents and students today, I had 2 students directing for the first time a really full production, and I was supervising them. And we were talking about the experience of directing, which he hadn't had before. And directing is rather similar. You have a vision in your head. You have a text. You have a bunch of, in this case, students, actors. And you watch it, like you're orchestrating it. You watch it unfold. And then there's a certain moment when it's alive on stage. You hear the words, and it's there. What's in your head is there, and I'm watching it.
Yeah, it's like conducting.
It's very moving. I mean, it's I nearly always, I'm in tears at that point when these kids have got it and they're out there in front of people, and people are amazed that their kids are out there and they don't even recognize them.
It's like my definition of happiness is acting on an idea, and that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
It's or just an ideal, perhaps. It's like conducting an orchestra, which I do when again a student group, when they finally get a piece and it gels and the whole thing is moving, the music takes over, just as the play takes over if you're directing, or if you're an actor, when the lines are finally in your blood and you don't even think about remembering the lines, you just, they're there. That's who you are. It's a wonderful experience.
Perhaps we could get back to England. Why were you in England to start with?
We were doing PhDs, theoretically.
In American literature.
In England. Canadians in England doing an American PhD.
We didn't want to go to the U.S. We wanted to go to England. So we found a tutor who would supervise us both.
Clearly we had a kind of ambivalent attitude already, now that I think about it. The principal thing was we wanted to live in England.
Well, it's a different perspective on America, right? So we've got why you did this and the importance and fulfilling nature of it. And you talked about a master printer. I wonder, is there anyone that you admire particularly?
Bob Barris. If you don't even know him, he's a. Do you know of his
The
work?
press at Scroll Road. In Ohio.
He still prints on a hand press on dampened paper. In terms of his printing, it's absolutely immaculate.
To me, Whittington is certainly one. John and Rose Randall. He's such a good publisher. Publishing is to me as important, every bit as important.
The skill of the choice of text.
Choicing the text, proper presentation of text design, the whole thing. But the publishing, it is publishing. You know, what we're doing is publishing principally. It happens to be done in an artisanal way.
You want to be able to appeal enough to a market to enable you to continue to do what you love to do.
Yes, of course that's true. I never think of that, to Jan's disgust. But that is true. But it also is that we want to promote a text which we believe in.
Yeah.
And I have to say that one of our sorrows, in a way, is that we can't really afford to do very much in the way of new poetry. It isn't that we aren't interested in it. There are two things. First of all, that there are a lot of classic texts which I think need to be brought back out and shown again. That's something that not very many other presses are doing at all. So it's not that we're the only ones, but we're certainly among the few. And the other thing is that, and I'm speaking partly as a poet myself, to have one's work published for the first time by a small press like ours usually puts it beyond the reach, no matter how cheaply we try to do it, puts it beyond the reach of people who should be reading the work. The work should be printed in a way first, published in a way first, which is pragmatic. It should get out to as many people as possible in this cheap a form, nicely designed, well done, and all the rest of it. It needn't be badly designed because it's cheap, or badly printed because it's cheap, but it needs to get out there.
And unfortunately,
we're no longer in a position to do it. It's really a shame, but there we go.
I think we mentioned that you've done about 40 books in total. I know when I've spoken to other private press owners, they talk about them as their children, and they don't like to play favorites, although some would rather that some of them had never been born. But I don't know if you feel that way about your progeny.
Oh yeah, you do have one.
I have one or two of those.
I don't think we feel that about the actual text of it. I mean, I don't think we've printed something we regret having printed. Certainly the execution of the design or the binding or the printing or whatever it is, it's not all of an even level. And so particularly books earlier on. So we can look back at them and say, this is where we were at this point.
What are you most proud of?
I think from my point of view as a designer, the two books I like best are Pericles, which we've just done, and one of the small books, Jan Swicky's 21
songs.
Small songs. That or Ian Hamilton Finley's Table Talk, which is just basically a pamphlet, but I've always been very, very fond of it. It's very simple.
Can you explain your fondness?
I think with the Finley piece, it's first of all that I like the text immensely. It's a series of aphorisms, and they're just delightful. One of them, by the way, in reference to our discussion about art versus craft, reads that in a secular age, craftsmen become artists and therapies philosophies. Like that very much. But it was printed on a paper which I like a lot, made by Turkey Mill in the 30s. Sometimes it's a mold-made, quite a rough, masculine kind of paper, which suits Ian. In polyphilus, 16-point polyphilus, first time we'd ever used it. Rather worn type.
But it has a kind of honesty about it.
Yeah, it's like Ian. It's right direct, there, and he's very blunt.
And again, it does justice to the author.
It does justice to the author and justice to the text. And it's just black with red pilcrows at the beginning of each aphorism. And I'll show it if I can dig one out. I'll show it.
For me, the two books would be, one would be Pericles. I mean, Pericles is basically the Avatar, and it was not just because of how it ended up, but the whole process of making it was the most collaborative and creatively exciting that we've done.
It's exciting to design. Right?
It was, and for me to print, because every opening was different, and there was a collaboration with Simon, who was just wonderful to work with, and
he would be the
Simon
engraver. Have you seen it?
He's the most intelligent illustrator that I can imagine. He understood the text as well as you did, and so they would have these conversations about how to illustrate this moment, how to bring it alive.
Right.
And so for me, it was
very literate illustrator.
Every opening was something I could revel in. It never became automatic. I think everything came together in that, as not perfectly, nothing's ever perfect, but as close as we've ever done. And then the second thing for me as a printer was Peter Lazaroff's
Endgrain
Editions 3, because it was enormously challenging to do his engravings and gratifying at the same time, because no one really knew his work before, and he's just the most spectacular engraver.
Well, I mean, technically, he's utterly brilliant. I mean, he caused a real stir when it came out.
But
Engravers just
his
went nuts.
blocks were diabolical to print. And
why was that?
Because he used to hand rub them, so there wasn't a concern as to whether or not they were level, whether they were type high. There was one block that was, in fact, a 1/16 of an inch difference from one corner to the other, and it was above type high. So I was wanting to print on the Vandercook because of its size. It was just kind of the biggest challenge I've ever had to overcome.
As a collector, and I'm speaking with Crispin and Jan Elsted, the proprietors of the Barbarian Press, based in Mission, British Columbia. Double-barreled question here. First of all, someone who loves fine press printing, how would you recommend they approach collecting in this field in general, and then specifically, what might you recommend they start off with yours?
Well, as to the first part, the answer used to be, and to some extent might still be, that you collect ephemera. In the old days, everybody used to print. We did. All the other presses used to print prospectuses and so on for books, and those are very collectible little pieces from the press and so on. Nowadays, very few of us do it anymore because everything's done online, and that's one of the things I really regret.
You mean like sending the prospectuses?
Sending prospectuses out by post, or now we do usually.
Although we still do a prospectus.
We do occasionally do. We did one for in fact, we did two for Pericles, and we've done one for Kerwin. The big projects, we tend to do it. If a fair is coming up, we'll sometimes do one for a new book, just so people have something to take away, but for the most part not. So the obvious thing to do, assuming that when people are starting to collect, they don't want to jump in too far right away until they have a sense of their taste and have tested the ground a little bit, I suppose to go to a good collection and a university library, a special collection or something, and have a look at some press books and get a sense of where you might like to begin.
Who might speak to you? And
who that's right. Who might speak to you? Whose style would suit your style as a reader, in your visual sense of how books should be. Of course, the other approach, I don't know why I didn't think of this first, is who publishes things you want to read.
Yeah,
I mean, if text is an issue, I mean, a lot of press books, the text is treated not as well, I should say, as the design of the book and the illustrations are. That's less the case perhaps now than it used to be, but it's still very much there.
Would something else useful would be to get a hold of parentheses too and have a look.
Yeah, that's right.
Either subscribe to it,
which is the house organ of the association.
Yeah, there are 2 a year, and it represents what's going on at the current moment, and it goes back a number of years as well. So
yeah, there are reviews of all sorts of books and pictures,
illustrations and stuff.
And the other thing is to get hold of a book like the one we were looking at from the Codex Foundation, Book Art Object, which is a compilation of many of the important presses right now, not just in the States and Canada, but in Britain and around the world. And we'll show you at least some pictures of what the books look like and so forth. Ultimately, you have somehow to see the books and handle them, I think, if you can before you buy them. Going to book fairs is a good way of doing that. If you go online and Google a press, you can find some dealers who carry books, and it might be that there's someone in your neck of the woods and you can go and visit them and look at the books there. But I do think it's important to see them and feel them in your hand before you take the jump.
But in terms of, if you were someone who were trying to get a sense of the range of our books, I think the Hoy Barbary would be an obvious place to go, and then which is the 25th bibliography of the press and history of the press. Endgrain contemporary wood engraving in North America. If someone were to collect us, they would have to be somebody interested in wood engravings.
And that took hold, didn't it, at some point? Your appreciation
of wood engravings started in the 80s.
84, actually.
The first book we did was The Christmas Carol with wood engravings by Edwina Ellis.
And what was it about wood engravings that got you excited?
They're perfectly idiomatic for hand printing, and for me as a printer, then that working on these blocks, and I did print them by hand on an Albion at that point. It just was every time I opened up the frisket and looked at the printed image, it was just like it was a new birth every time.
They were made for each other.
It's a relief process, just like type.
They're completely compatible, doing it that way, and the impression of the engraving into the paper gives it a three-dimensional quality, which is all what letterpress is all about.
Sorry, I interrupted.
I'm at about 5 minutes.
Okay.
I apologize.
Not a problem.
So if you have anything, particularly from me...
Well, is there, in terms of the aspect of the business, if you want to call it that, what you're doing and what you do specifically, is there anything that you'd like to express? Because what is it that you do primarily?
Oh, okay. Well, I do all of the printing. I mean, there's hardly an exception to that because Crispin doesn't really care for it. I don't really like typesetting, although we can both do both.
But you love what?
I love, again, it's that business of of seeing the visual representation of what is a combination of both our imaginations and the imagination of the artist. I like to see the tangible thing in front of me, and it's such a measurable process. I could, if I'm successful or not, whatever standard I set for myself, which is as high as I possibly can. I know exactly what I've achieved. There's never any question about it.
Do you set your sights on this person in Ohio you mentioned? Do you say, okay, I'm going to be as... No,
you don't think
it's not a competitive thing.
It's not competitive at all. And I don't think I can look at anybody and say, I wish I could do that. Occasionally I see things, I go, how did they do that? I know who. Young guy, Russell Merritt. Right. I look at what he does, and it's just extraordinary passion for detail and for doing typographical lettering and coloring of pigments and registration. All that technical stuff I find somewhat baffling, because I much more get in there and do it and kind of work with it and figure out a way rather than kind of planning all ahead how it's all going to work. I kind of a trial and error. I've developed the techniques that work for me. I am working on a book on printing wood engravings.
How to,
yeah. My experience of it. So it's not going to be so much a how-to as a journal.
Here's how I did it.
This is how I did it. This is what I suggest. Because, it's a craft that needs to be handed on.
Why do you think it needs to be handed on?
Well, because, I've 35 years now of doing this, and I've learned some things along the way. Somebody comes behind me. What a waste to have to spend 35 years finding out what I've
on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah. We all need to learn from each other. We all need to feed and inspire and move it all forward and keep it alive. Because as much as books are going digital and all that, I don't think we're ever going to lose the necessity for the tactile and for the sensual experience of the book.
Why not? Why won't we lose that?
I think it's a basic human need. I don't think we can separate ourselves and put everything, the world out there on a screen or in a phone. We need, as human beings, we still are all going to need that sense of touch, sense of being part of organically of the world.
The sensuality of
I mean, I have to believe that. I mean, to me, humanity stops if we don't keep doing that, and that's not going to happen. So
I'm going to try and weave in something about redeeming here.
Yes. Redeeming might be the sense of sometimes it gets lost for a while and needs to be rediscovered and passed on in through different eyes and hands in different ways.
Which is what happened in the 50s and 60s really with letterpress, when it was starting to go out in phototype setting, and then offset was coming in, and everyone was dumping letterpress right and left, which is how our generation found the stuff and started doing it again. Most of the presses that you find in presses, at least for people our age, are saved from the scrap heap effectively.
Yes. Okay, well, excuse me. I'm so sorry.
Not at all.
Continue this, but I have to talk to a parent. It's nice to meet you.
Yes, likewise.
Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You were asking a few minutes ago about who we admired. I mentioned Whittington, which is absolutely one of the best. I think for me, maybe my favorite press. I think we have more Whittington books than any other contemporary press. But many of the Dutch printers are the printers whose designs I like best. Bram de Doos, for example, or just Dutch type design generally, and Dutch book design seems to me to have. It's not the way I design at all, but it's something that I love because of its cleanness and its spare quality. It's very elegant, very classical, and I have a large side of that in me. The other side
in
of
your
me
blood,
is in my sensibility.
Ashendene, you were saying, is the same.
Ashendene,
spare.
well, yeah, but you can hardly call Ashendene spare, but compared to the Kelmscott,
Yes.
it certainly is. Doves, on the other hand, I find rather chilly. And I don't like Cobden Sanderson. I said somewhere in a review once that I considered him a metaphysical punk. I really don't care for him, so I don't much care for his books either.
Will Reuter is a huge fan.
Will and I have never thought about that, but
Right.
we might one day, who knows. No, I admire Cobden Sanderson. I admire
Yeah.
the books. I just don't like them. I don't warm to them. We have the Bible, and I do admire it enormously, but I don't love it the way I love the Kelmscott Chaucer. There's a side of me which likes austerity. As a poet, certainly that's true in much of my later work particularly, and in music I tend to like sometimes music which is quite spare. But I have another side, equally balanced, which is full of a love for the ostentatious and the Baroque and everything. Robert Bringhurst and I have talked about as poets, talked about our poetry. And I mentioned to Robert once that he writes poetry for flute and drum, and I write it for full orchestra and choir. It's just the kind of noise we like to make.
Now, what about the typography?
Typographically, it's rather the same. I mean, I don't think I hope I'm not ostentatious as a typographer, but if you look at Robert's book design, it's not more like the Dutch. It has a much clearer line to the Dutch than mine does. I like warmth in a book. What I conceive of as warmth, a kind of humanity, a kind of Falstaffian quality,
Specifically, what would relay that to you then?
Generosity of page size, some use of color, a choice of type. For example, I have never cared, although I admire them again, I've never particularly cared for Zapp's typefaces. Palatino was one time was just everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere without looking at it, and it's unexceptionable as a typeface. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Composes perfectly and all the rest of it, but I would never use it. To me, it's somewhat po-faced, just a little too serious. I like type with a twinkle in its eye. I like Polyphilus because, in a way, it's a typeface which is a mistake. You know the story of Polyphilus, that's a typeface. It's a copy of the typeface used by Aldus in the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, which is one of the very great, maybe the greatest early book, greatest of his books, perhaps. When Stanley Morrison wanted to create a typeface based on this, he was sent photographs of some pages from the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, and he used that as the model for the Polyphilus typeface. So it was virtually a copy. After the type was cut and cast and they proofed it up, he saw some other pages, another copy of the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, and realized that the pages they'd used had been over-inked, which is why the Polyphilus has that rather heavy, I think, warm quality to it. But it has a kind of robustness that I like enormously. We used it for Pericles. We've used it, for the Ian Hamilton Finlay pamphlet I mentioned, and one or two other places. I think it's probably my favorite of the classical faces to use, closely followed by Bembo. It's very flexible. You can set virtually anything in Bembo, which is usually a condemnation of a typeface, but there are some things I wouldn't use Bembo for.
Like what?
Well, I wouldn't, for example, set an essay on the Bauhaus in Bembo. I wouldn't set Eliot in Bembo. There are certain...
Why not?
I think Eliot needs something more like in Spectrum, maybe. Something much, again, slightly more austere, more slender, drier. It's very odd. I find myself sometimes describing typefaces rather the way people describe wines, It's big shaggy nose, and decorum pushing about under the surface, that kind of thing.
And yet it is invisible to most people.
It is, that's true.
But I suppose, in a way, wine is just wine to a lot of people, whereas if you pay attention to what's going on, all of these nuances come out and make a difference.
They do. The thing is that most people look, especially now with computers, most people look at typefaces in such a cursory way that they don't really ever take them in.
I might disagree with you, though, on that, because at least now, if you're in Word or some word processing software, you can pull down a whole list of them and you can see what they look like.
That's precisely my point. All you're seeing is one or two words, the name of the typeface or something. The only way really to understand a typeface is to read a text of some size.
Yeah.
And beyond that is to read the same text in two or three different typefaces. because it's really in contrast or comparison to one another that you begin to understand how typefaces work.
But I suppose in most cases it's working underneath the surface because you don't really know what's going on unless you pay attention.
If a book is really well designed, the typeface appropriately chosen and well set, you shouldn't notice the type. And that means that it's good.
It means it's good, and if you look at it and read it in a different typeface, you may feel differently,
feel differently about the text.
Pleased about reading it.
I would say, for example, that if you were to read King Lear, let's say, in Centaur and King Lear in Polyphilus, you would get two quite different experiences of the text. Centaur, which is another typeface I admire but would never use, I find very delicate and rather perfumed, even slightly effeminate. It's a lovely face. The only thing I would think of setting it in would be probably something like Racine or Corneille or something of the French Enlightenment. You know, that it was in fact written, of course, or first designed to be used in a French text. So it may very well be that that's precisely what Rogers was after. But I'm dismayed by the way it's used all over the place. I mean, Centaur has become a very popular face because it is so attractive. It is lovely, but it doesn't suit very much. I don't think it has very much versatility.
It's used because of its intrinsic beauty rather than its appropriateness.
Rather than its appropriateness, yeah. And it's a kind of beauty which I think is slightly, I was going to say ephemeral, it's not the word I want, but it's a bit misty, a bit wispy, you know?
Yes.
It doesn't have very much traction somehow as a typeface visually to me. Whereas, say, a face like Polyphilus has all kinds of traction, as does Baskerville, as does, Bimbo. By traction, I mean simply that it holds the eye without interfering with the apprehension of the eye.
You run workshops periodically here in Mission. Is this something that, and again, it's part of the important role as educator, passing along, the craft?
Yes, we started doing them in the 90s. They were, from the beginning, quite well attended. We could only have a few people, as you get gathered being around here. We don't have vast amounts of room, so usually we limited them to 5. I think once we had 6, and it was a real jam. Because people tend to stay with us as well when they're here. So we have people parked all over the floor and on the couches and everything else. We take 6 full days, the whole week, and we begin with a bit of a background on private presses and the history of the book. Each of the students is asked to bring a text of a specified length, no more than 500 or 600 words of prose, or maybe a couple of sonnets or a poem. And each student designs a pamphlet, which is sewn into wraps at the end. The setting, because most of them have never set type before, and it's not, as you know, when you're starting out, it's not a very quick process.
It humbles a person.
It does tend to, yeah. And then we take them out to the press room and get them set up with a typecase, having chosen a typeface with them, and we'll try to guide them into choosing a typeface that's appropriate for what they've chosen to print. Talk about some of their design ideas and get them setting the type as quickly as possible. So it's a very rapid process, of course. This is only really a glimpse of what one has to learn if it's going to go on doing it. And then once they've set the type and they've got their title page all sorted out and everything, then they get handed over to Jan, and Jan takes them through the printing process. And they end up with these little pamphlets at the end of the week. They're useful for us because they give us a breath of fresh air. We get different perspectives, and we get enthusiasm and a chance to stand back from our own work and look at things through someone else's eyes. It also satisfies our interest in teaching, of course. Several of the people who've gone through our workshops have actually ended up setting up presses themselves and going on with them. You know, it's been a very valued part of our work. It is important, either by example or by direct instruction, to keep the craft alive, to make people aware of it.
Why do you think that is?
Partly for the reasons that Jan said. I think that tactility, the sensuality of knowing, is something which we need to keep alive.
I want to keep drilling there, though.
Well, because we're sensual animals.
Why can't we just touch something else?
Oh, well, we can touch something. I don't mean necessarily just books. I mean the world other than the digital world. What do they call it?
Virtual.
The virtual world. It's always a phrase which gives me the wham-whams.
But we're making the case for the book.
And I have to speak for myself, and of course I'm a dinosaur. I'm 64 years old. I was raised with books. I have not even a love-hate, an acceptance-hate relationship with computers, I suppose. Texts are perceived differently from a computer screen than they are when they're on paper, printed on paper.
As you say, too, that you take a picture of the brain and it actually operates differently.
Yes,
when
exactly.
You're reading.
That's what I understand.
Yeah.
Well, I'm saying that there's a canon in place of literature. Let's just speak of literature for the moment, not necessarily simply the promulgation of knowledge, but literature. There's a literature which has been created in all languages, not just English, which was created in a world in which reading, in the sense of a physical book, an object, was the process by which these were apprehended. The understanding of them which has been passed on, the way they were intended to be read, and the way they've been interpreted and passed on as exemplars of a certain way of thinking, a certain social attitude, a certain philosophical position, all have come through that process. So I think to keep the canon alive, first of all, we need books. I'm not saying that you can't put Shakespeare up digitally. I mean, all these other things are all there. We can all pull these things off the net if we want to for quick reference. But for reading, that is, for the considered habitation of a text.
To habitate it in the way that when it was originally written, to get the same experience, you have to actually turn a page.
I think so. Yes, and that's the other thing. There's the whole sequential element, the way in which a text is revealed. And the way in which you can search a text by hand, which you can't do with a computer. I mean, it is true. Of course, you can plug a word into a search engine and they're all there, you know. Every use of the word thumb in War and Peace can be yours for the having, but the process is not the same. Yeah. It's like the digitization of library catalog cards. So much was lost when those cards were dumped and the thing was put digitally. Not the information, clearly that was still there, except when it's been once or twice unfortunately erased. But what was lost is the process of searching. The things you come across by serendipity in and around the thing you're actually looking for. And some information which was considered to be of little consequence, provenance, for example, or notes about the text, which were often written on the backs of these cards.
Like marginalia, really.
Like marginalia, yeah, which are lost. And that speaks to another aspect of the digital side of things, which I think is insidious, and that is that we are determined to erase history. The digital world tends to look forward, but not backward at all, and it's not reflective.
This is a defense of the book, but what about a defense of the finely printed book?
I don't know that one needs to defend an attempt or a successful attempt to create a thing in the most suitable way, which is always the most beautiful way. You know, beauty is useful. It's not just a bit of excess. Beauty is a central thing. It's essential. It's a useful point. So that if you created a book well, in that the best possible way, whether you do it by letterpress or whether you do it offset, you've done it the right way. I mean, when you talk about the press book, the artisanal book, you take a book like our little edition of the Eve of St. Agnes, which I mentioned earlier on. Of course, you can find that text printed beautifully by any number of processes, including other private press books, I'm sure, and certainly offset books of every description. You can find it in anthologies and collections of Keats and everything else, illustrated and not. But what you get when you get our edition is our reading of the poem. And Andy English's reading, who was the illustrator for it. So you get a reading of the text which is as viable as one actor reading it as opposed to another actor or another person reading it. The same question, I think, arises if someone were to say, well, look, I've seen Twelfth Night, I don't need to see it again.
Each is a unique experience.
Each is a unique experience, and each is an interpretation of a text through a more or less informed, depending on who it is, a more or less informed mind and sensibility. I mean, there are totally cretinous performances of Shakespeare where the productions go completely against the text and make no sense whatsoever. But even in those, there's sometimes an interesting notion. My concern is that very often with press books and performances of plays and operas and so on, you have a situation where a particular point is noticed, and you say, wouldn't it be interesting if we did it such a way? And the entire thing becomes skewed because it's all done from that one fairly minor perspective. I can tell you an example. Ian McKellen's production of Richard III, which was filmed 10, 15 years ago.
Brilliant.
Brilliant in many ways, yeah. All kinds of interesting bits and pieces. When his jeep gets overturned at the end and he says, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Of course, that's a new way of seeing the line, right? But it isn't a particularly useful way of seeing the line. But more to the point, I think the notion that this was set in kind of the fascist 30s, and all the Woodvilles, the sort of new nobility, were Americans. I mean, it's clearly an echo of the whole Wallace Simpson thing. Again, it's like a remark at a cocktail party. It's fun, it's interesting, but I question whether one should build an entire production around that. Well, the same thing applies to private press books, and one doesn't wish to name names, but there are certainly editions of classical texts or canonic texts done by private presses, which don't do the text proper service because they put the text in a position of being subservient to a notion by the printer or the designer. And the notion is ephemeral to the text.
You're saying then it's a poor performance because the actual typeface, let's say, or the layout or the paper is chosen more in aid or service of this notion, but then again the notion is their interpretation of the text.
Yeah, but when I say a notion, I mean one particular bit of it. You're just picking up one little thing and saying, well, let's go with that.
In closing then, obviously you believe in the importance of what you're doing. I wonder if you could, two things then, explain that importance and convey it to a young person who may be inclined in the same direction.
First of all, I think I should say that I don't believe that if none of our books had ever been printed, the world would be a much worse place. This is not the point I'm making. I think the work is important. It's important at a certain level. I mean, it's not earth-shaking, just so that that's out there. But that said, I think there are three things which need to be emphasized and passed on and understood by people, and I think they're in danger of disappearing, probably largely because of the nature of the digital age. First is delight. Delight is not happy. It's not the same thing as happiness. It's not the same thing as joy. It's not the same thing as apprehension in the sense of learning. It's all those things combined into a sense of well-being as a consequence of having taken in a text or a piece of music or a view or an animal or whatever it is that you're delighted in. I think the digital world, the apprehension of information or through the medium of a computer, is less inclined to give delight because, first of all, it's too quick, it's too ephemeral, and secondly, because the digital way of looking at the material that comes through the computer is that it is information, not that it's knowledge. And I think the distinction between information and knowledge is one that needs to be understood, and it's in knowledge that delight lies. The second thing is proportion. Proportion in the sense of understanding the relative importance of one thing to another. Proportion is probably most obviously exemplified to me. I mean, you can talk about proportion in architecture and proportion in the massive, or the way a painting is constructed or a photograph is composed. But I mean proportion in a very basic sense, and that is, as it's best exemplified in the sense of humor. The reason we laugh at things or cry at things is because of the proportion or the disproportion of them within the great scheme of our lives or of life as we see it, or the world, or whatever the forum, the theater happens to be for this particular moment. And to me, proportion is something else which gets skewed if you don't have art, artisanal art, painting, sculpture, architecture, music, finely printed books, poetry, and so on. Because proportion comes from a human, in both its strengths and its failures, a human apprehension of the world, an understanding of life, which can't be filtered through a number of codes and algorithms and turned into some kind of meaningful entity. It's something which has to be lived. It's a process, and it takes time. And time, computers are not interested in time. They're interested in getting rid of it and being as quick as possible. Instantaneous is what computers like. Mm-hmm. Neither delight nor proportion can be instantaneous. They simply can't be. And the third thing is decorum. You probably know that proportion and decorum were two key elements in the Elizabethan approach to prosody, that is, to the construction of verse. Proportion in the sense of taking an argument and constructing it in a way which was effective, or in the way of making a line of poetry which sounded well, and so on. That was proportion. But decorum had to do with the relative relationship between the different parts of a work, or of works related to one another. We now use decorum, if we use it at all, to mean manners. And manners, in fact, is part of that. What we call manners is a process of behaving in a way, decorously we would say, which allows everyone in a room, in a conversation, in a company, in some sort of gathering, in a business, to work affably, genially, and effectively with one another. And through that affability and that geniality and that effectiveness, to be able to achieve what in common everyone wishes to achieve, and what the individuals wish to achieve within that company, as themselves, within that group, as themselves, and in relation to other people or groups of people. So decorum, again, on the internet, decorum is something which goes completely by the way if, for example, you look for information, in quotes, on Wikipedia, let's say, or if you Google something. What you get is not proportion, first of all, because you just get the top thing is the one that's had the most hits, and the bottom thing is the one that's had the least. But the bottom thing may, in fact, be the one that's closest to some truth or some real understanding. Right?
Or the top thing may have been what someone paid to put there.
Or exactly, yeah. There could be any number of reasons there. So proportion goes out the way. And decorum because, let's take the social forums, right? You look at comments on an article in the newspaper, and you discover an extraordinary range of what we might think of as representative of the human or the social condition. You get everything from people coming out with, filthy execrations of people and all sorts of slanderous remarks if they're not cut off before that, to long and rather turgid and probably often quite learned dissertations on things which nobody reads because they're too long, and nobody reads a text longer than about 10 lines on the net anyway, and everything in between. Mm-hmm. And that's not even taking into account the different attitudes towards the ideas as they might be in the article which is being discussed. So we have there a lack of proportion because nothing is in any sense put into place with anything else. We're left to do that, but there's not enough space for us to see what we need to order. And decorum is gone because there's no intercourse between the people who are making the comments. They're all out there individually coming out with their ideas in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. There's no social integration any longer. So I think books, because they are both personal interpretations on the part of the designer and the publisher, and the writer, of course, first and foremost the writer, books are apprehended using all those three things. They use proportion, they use decorum, and they result in delight because they pass through a human, echt human, filter or group of filters. They are created through the human spirit, created through hands, created through ideas. Both the abstract and the concrete entities or parts of the human condition are represented in books. And I think we need to have books, and will continue to need to have books, so that people will sometimes slow it down enough to be able to be delighted.
And to be human.
And to be human, which is in a way part and parcel of the same thing. Our motto at the press is a phrase from Horace's Ars Poetica, utile dulci, which means the useful with the beautiful. I said before that beauty is useful, and it is, but usefulness is also beautiful. If the two are completely inextricable to us, and I think that's what I mean by what I've just been saying. Not too much length.
No, it was beautifully said and useful to listen to. Just finally, when you were talking, I was thinking about the importance of a sense of wonder.
Mm-hmm. Part of delight.
And I think that what you've done is you've produced objects that enable that, produce that.
I hope we have, but I hope the wonder isn't at the technique that we've used, but rather at the text that's shown by that technique. I think it's often the case that when people look at things which are made by hand, especially in our lifetime when it's been much less common than it was before, they're simply thunderstruck with the fact that this has happened, with the phenomenon of the thing, and sometimes don't get past that to the thing itself.
The fact that you want people to read these books.
That's exactly it, yes. We want them to read the text. I was reading a book, I'm reading a book at the moment, a wonderful book by a man named Edmund de Waal called The Hare with Amber Eyes. I don't know if you've come across it. It's a book about some netsuke, little Japanese carvings, which he inherited, and he tracks down the history of these carvings over many generations of his family, and quite a lot of interesting history. It's one of these books that wanders all over the place like a puppy tracking a beetle. It's my favorite kind of book. And in it, he's quoting a Japanese potter talking about the nature of what he does and suggesting that what makes an object beautiful, a mass-produced object like a bowl or a cup or a spoon, something very, very simple, very beautiful, is not that it's connected with any particular person, but the very fact that it isn't. That a good potter, for example, will make thousands of bowls, and they're all beautiful because, sure, partly it's because they're all slightly different. They're all unique. But it's also beautiful because the ego has gone from it. It's become so ingrained in the hands of the potter that he no longer has to think about what he's doing. And in that sense, it becomes pure form, pure beauty, pure usefulness. A bowl, in fact, is a very good example of a metaphor for what I'm talking about. It's like acting. When the words finally sink into your blood and you become the character on stage, it's no longer about Laurence Olivier or Gwyneth Paltrow or whoever it is who's acting. It's about the character. It's about the words. It's about the situation that's going on. And when we lose that sense of ego, I think is when we first begin to understand what's behind the process, what the play or the music or the book is all about. It's why I intensely dislike the use of the word artists in connection with what we do. The term book arts drives me wild, and book artists and artist books. I understand that there are people who do these books who see the whole thing quite a different way from me, and that's fine. That's perfectly legitimate and very interesting. But as far as our books are concerned, and the kind of books we do, I really intensely object to having them referred to as works of art. They're not. They're works of craft, but they are first and foremost texts presented as best they can be presented, as best we can do it.
Thank you for doing it. I've been speaking with Crispin Elsted, and prior to that, both Crispin and Jan Elsted, in your lovely book-lined study here close to Mission in British Columbia. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.